What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to bring you semi-competitive EDH content that's both fast-paced and entertaining. In today's match, we decided to proxy and sleeve up some of the legendary creatures from the new upcoming Ikoria set, just to test them out and see which ones we thought were the best. As a quick disclaimer, you may notice that the video footage looks a little bit different than our normal video footage. The reason is we took this footage from our Twitch stream, so if you want to watch these games live during the quarantine season, I guess you could call it, we've been streaming quite frequently and been using that footage for our videos since we can't meet up in person. Before we get into the opening hands and the deck introductions, we have some quick channel promotions. The first being, if you want to rep some Casually Competitive merch or pre-order one of our playmats, there's links in the description for our merch store as well as our playmat Kickstarter. On top of the merch store, if you want to help support us financially and you like what we do, we have a Patreon and a YouTube join button. We greatly appreciate all those who help support us in this way. It really does go a long way to help us produce these videos. Next, if you're looking to buy cards in the near future, click on our TCG affiliate link in the description below. After clicking on that link, any purchases you make help the channel out at no cost to you. And finally, if you want to join our community and get to know us a little better, there's a link for our Discord in the description. Now, with the promotions out of the way, let's get into the opening hands. Going first, we have Jordan playing Rielle the Everwise. The goal of this Izzet deck is to naturally storm off, getting insane value off of discarding cards off of wheels or cards like Tolarian Winds in order to constantly keep his hand full and then win the game through something like an Aetherflux Reservoir. Jordan's opening hand today contained a Gemstone Caverns, an Arid Mesa, a Pyroblast, an Arcane Signet, a Copy Artifact, a Narset's Reversal, and a Windfall. Going second, we have Joseph playing Zirda the Dawnmaker. The goal of this Boros deck is to use Zirda's ability in order to reduce the activation cost on something like a Basalt Monolith or a Grim Monolith in order to generate infinite mana by consistently tapping and untapping it and then winning the game through some type of outlet like a Walking Ballista. There are other side win cons in this deck like a Heliod Sun-Crowned in combination with the Walking Ballista, but the main goal is the 2-card infinite mana engine into an outlet. Joseph's opening hand contained a Plains, an Arid Mesa, a Sun-Baked Canyon, a Red Elemental Blast, a Banefire, a Direfleet Daredevil, and an Aura of Silence. Going third, we have Bill playing Illuna, the Apex of Wishes. This is a food chain based deck that looks to generate infinite creature mana with food chain and something like an Eternal Scourge or a Squee the Immortal in order to infinitely mutate his commander and get the exact permanence he needs on the board in order to win the game. Bill's opening hand contained a Shivan Reef, a Bloodstained Mire, a Polluted Delta, a Vexing Shusher, a Spellseeker, an Eternal Witness, and due to the London Mulligan, he put a Forest to the bottom of his library. And going last today, we have Nate playing Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. The goal of this Simic deck is to use Kinnan's ability to generate infinite mana off something like a Basalt Monolith, which will now tap for 4 mana, allowing infinite untaps and taps, or through a Birds of Paradise and a Freed from the Real, which will allow him to generate infinite colored mana. The goal of having infinite mana is to activate Kinnan as many times as possible in order to find a Thrasios and put him onto the battlefield, and then use the infinite mana to draw the rest of his library. With his library in his hand and infinite mana, he has many ways to win. Nate's opening hand contained a Forest, a Forbidden Orchard, a Cavern of Souls, a Mox Opal, a Llanowar Elves, a Thassa's Oracle, and a Spellseeker. Now with the deck introductions and the opening hands out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Jordan starts off this game by drawing, playing a Gemstone Caverns as his land for turn, and then passing the turn to Joseph. Joseph draws, plays a tapped Boseiju Who Shelters All as his land for turn, and then ships the turn over to Bill. Bill draws, plays a Shivan Reef as his land for turn, and really liking the quick pace of this turn 1, gives the turn to Nate. Nate draws, plays a Forest, and breaking tradition taps the Forest to cast a Llanowar Elves. The Llanowar Elves resolves, and he then, for 0 mana, casts a Mox Opal. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, draws, plays an Arid Mesa as his land for turn, and then immediately cracks it, paying 1 life, to put a Steam Vents into the battlefield and pays 2 additional life to have it enter untapped. He then taps both his lands to cast an Arcane Signet. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and then plays and cracks his own Arid Mesa, searching up a Sacred Foundry to the battlefield and again paying 2 life to have it enter untapped. He then taps both his lands to cast a Grim Monolith. With half of his combo on the battlefield, he decides to give the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays a Polluted Delta as his land for turn, and then cracks it, paying 1 life to shock in a Breeding Pool. With nothing left, he ships the turn over to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, plays a Cavern of Souls as his land for turn, and as it enters the battlefield, he names Human. He then taps for 3 mana to cast an uncounterable Spellseeker. The Spellseeker resolves, enters the battlefield, and Nate searches up a Nature's Claim to his hand. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, draws, plays a Prismatic Vista, and then pays 1 life to crack it to search up a snow-covered mountain to the battlefield. He then taps for 3 mana to cast his commander, Rielle the Everwise. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, plays a Sunbaked Canyon as his land for turn, and then taps his Grim Monolith for 3 mana, and then uses 2 of that to cast a Talisman of Conviction. He then taps for 2 additional mana and uses this floating colorless to cast an Aura of Silence. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays a Bloodstained Mire as his land for turn, and then pays 1 life to crack it to shock in a Steam Vents. He then, for 2 mana, casts a Mana Crypt due to the tax effect of Aura of Silence, and then for 3 mana, casts a Spellseeker. When it enters the battlefield, he searches up a Manipulate Fate. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, plays an Exotic Orchard as his land for turn, and then taps for 2 mana to cast an uncounterable Kinnan Bonder Prodigy due to the Cavern of Souls. He then goes to pass the turn to Jordan, and in Nate's end step, Jordan taps for 1 red mana to cast a Pyroblast targeting Kinnan. Kinnan is destroyed, and Jordan then goes to his turn. On his turn, Jordan untaps, draws, plays an Academy Ruins as his land for turn, and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Merfolk Looter. He then, for 3 mana, casts a Windfall. In response to the Windfall, Joseph taps for 1 red mana to cast a red Elemental Blast targeting Rielle. He takes 1 damage from his Talisman, and then Rielle is destroyed. Still in response to the Windfall, Nate taps for 1 green mana to cast a Nature's Claim targeting Joseph's Grim Monolith. The Grim Monolith is destroyed, Joseph gains 4 life, and then the Windfall resolves, everybody discards their hand and draws 5 cards. With nothing left, Jordan gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and then taps his Boseiju to cast a Mana Vault, taking 2 damage. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Thrill of Possibility as an additional cost, discarding Rest in Peace. It resolves, he draws 2 cards, and he then plays a Mountain as his land for turn, and then for 0 mana, casts a Lotus Petal. He then taps his Mana Vault to cast a Basalt Monolith. The Basalt Monolith enters the battlefield, and Joseph then taps for 3 mana to cast his commander, Zirda the Dawnmaker. Now he is able to untap Basalt Monoliths, however at this point he can generate infinite colorless, but does not have an outlet, and has to pass the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then plays an island as his land for turn, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Mana Vault due to the tax effect of Aura of Silence. He then for 1 green mana casts an Arbor Elf. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and then plays a Breeding Pool as his land for turn, paying 2 life to have it enter untapped. He then for 3 mana casts a Manglehorn. The Manglehorn resolves, and then with its enter the battlefield effect, he targets the Basalt Monolith in order to destroy it. In response to this ETB effect, Joseph, for 0 mana, casts a Deflecting Swat, attempting to change the target of the Manglehorn ETB to Bill's Mana Crypt. In response to the Deflecting Swat, Bill taps for 2 mana to cast a Delay. There are no further responses, the Deflecting Swat is delayed, and the Manglehorn's ETB trigger destroys Joseph's Basalt Monolith. Now with the stack clear, Nate pays 2 mana to cast a Mana Crypt. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, draws, plays a Misty Rainforest as his land for turn, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Library of Lang. It resolves and it enters the battlefield tapped due to Manglehorn. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and at the beginning of his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault. He then for 0 mana casts a Mox Opal, which again enters the battlefield tapped due to Manglehorn. He then goes to combat and swings his 3/3 commander at Bill. Bill decides to block with Spellseeker, no damage is dealt, and Joseph then ships the turn over to Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep wins his mana crypt trigger, not taking any damage. He then also in his upkeep pays 4 mana to untap his mana vault. He then draws, and in his first main phase, plays a command tower as his land for turn, and then pays 6 mana to mutate his commander Illuna Apex of Wishes onto his Arbor Elf. Illuna resolves, and when it's mutated, he exiles cards from the top of his library until he exiles a non-land permanent, and the first one he hits is a Squee the Immortal. He decides to put Squee onto the battlefield, and then the mutation is complete. Illuna is tapped since the Arbor Elf was initially tapped, and Bill then decides to pass the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep wins his mana crypt trigger, not taking any damage. He then plays an island as his land for turn and taps for 4 mana, including his Cavern of Souls, to cast an uncounterable Kinnan. In response to the cast, Jordan pays 1 life to crack his Misty Rainforest, searching up a snow-covered island to the battlefield. With Kinnan now resolved, Nate taps his mana to cast a dramatic reversal, floating 1 green mana from his Llanowar Elves since it taps for 2 green mana due to Kinnan. In response to the dramatic reversal, Joseph pays 1 white mana to cast a Path to Exile targeting Kinnan. Path resolves, Kinnan is exiled, Nate decides to put it into his command zone, and then Nate gets a tapped island to the battlefield. Dramatic reversal then resolves, and Nate untaps all of his non-land permanents. He then uses his floating green mana to cast an Elvish Mystic. With his plans disrupted and nothing left to do, Nate gives the turn to Jordan. On Nate's end step, Jordan activates his Merfolk Looter in order to draw a card and then discard a card, which was an Intuition. Jordan then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and then casts his commander Rielle the Everwise for 5 mana. With nothing left, Jordan gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps and in his upkeep pays 4 mana to untap his Mana Vault, taking 2 damage from the lands that he tapped. Mana Vault is a triggered ability, not an activated ability, which is why it still costs 4, even though his commander is on the battlefield. He then also in his upkeep removes a suspend counter from deflecting SWAT. He then draws, goes to his first main phase, and taps his mana, including sacrificing his Lotus Petal for a white to cast a Ranger Captain of Eos. In response to the Ranger Captain, Bill taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Mystical Tutor. The Tutor resolves and Bill searches up a Nature's Claim to the top of his library. The Ranger Captain resolves and off the ETB, Joseph gets a Weathered Wayfarer to his hand. With nothing left, Joseph gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped, and then draws his card for turn, goes to combat, and swings his commander at Joseph for 6 commander damage. Joseph takes the damage, and Bill gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn, and then taps his Ancient Tomb for mana, taking 2 damage, as well as Cavern of Souls to help recast his commander, Kinnan, yet again. Kinnan resolves, and Nate goes to pass the turn to Jordan, and on Nate's end step, Jordan activates his Merfolk Looter to draw a card, and then discard a Lotus Petal, and due to Rielle being on the battlefield, Jordan draws 1 card. Jordan then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Control the Court. The Control the Court resolves, Jordan draws 4 cards, discards 3 cards at random, putting 1 to the top due to Library of Leng, and then due to the discards, he draws 3 more cards off of his commander's ability. He then pays 2 life to cast a Gitaxian Probe targeting Bill. He looks at Bill's hand, draws a card, and then for 2 mana, casts a Dockside Extortionist. When it enters the battlefield, he gets 8 tapped treasure tokens due to Manglehorn. With nothing left, Jordan gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and then taps for 1 white mana to cast a Weathered Wayfarer. The Wayfarer resolves, and he then taps for 3 mana to cast an Imperial Recruiter, taking 1 damage from his lands. The Recruiter resolves, enters the battlefield, and off the ETB tutor, Joseph searches up a Goblin Engineer to his hand. He then takes 2 damage from his lands to cast this Goblin Engineer. He decides to ignore the ETB effect and doesn't search an artifact to his graveyard. With nothing left, Joseph gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then decides to not untap Mana Vault, and in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault. He then draws, and again goes to combat and swings his 6/6 commander at Nate. Nate takes the damage, and then Bill goes to pass the turn to Nate. On Bill's end step, Nate pays 7 mana to activate his commander in order to look at the top 5 cards of his library, and he puts a non-human Birds of Paradise onto the battlefield. With nothing left, Nate goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and then for 5 mana, casts a Cloudstone Curio. The Cloudstone resolves, and Nate then taps for 2 mana to cast Thrasios Triton Hero. In response to Thrasios not wanting Nate to get that much value, Jordan taps for 2 mana to cast a counterspell. Thrasios is countered, and Nate goes to pass the turn to Jordan. On Nate's end step, Jordan activates his Merfolk Looter to draw a card, discard 1 card, and then draw another card off of his commander's ability. Jordan then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and then sacrifices 7 of his treasures to cast an Alhamret's Archive. The Archive resolves, and Jordan taps for 3 mana to cast a Flux. Priorities get around, and not wanting Jordan to loot through a good deal of his library, Bill taps for 1 red mana to cast a Pyroblast, countering the Flux. With the Flux countered, Jordan decides to tap for 2 mana to cast a Merchant Scroll. It resolves, and he searches up a Tolarian Winds to his hand. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and in his upkeep removes a final suspend counter from his deflecting swat. However, since there's no targets, it just goes to the graveyard. He then pays 1 mana to activate his Weathered Wayfarer to search up an Inventor's Fair to his hand. He then plays this Inventor's Fair as his land for turn, and then immediately sacrifices his Ranger Captain of Eos in order to activate it. In response to this pseudo-silence, Nate pays 7 mana to activate his commander. He looks at the top 5 cards, does not find a non-human creature card, and then puts them on the bottom of his library. In response to the Ranger Captain activation still, Jordan taps his Merfolk Looter to activate it, drawing a card, discarding a card, then drawing 1 more card. There are no further responses to the Ranger Captain of Eos, and with his opponents basically silenced, Joseph pays 4 mana to crack his Inventor's Fair to search up a Walking Ballista to his hand. He then pays 1 red mana to activate his Goblin Engineer, sacking Mana Vault in order to bring back Basalt Monolith. It does enter the battlefield tapped, however Joseph simply pays 1 mana to untap it due to his commander reducing that activated ability cost. He then taps his Basalt Monolith for 3 mana, untapping it for 1, and repeats this process to generate infinite colorless mana. He then uses some of this infinite colorless to cast a Walking Ballista, which is infinitely big. He then removes counters from Walking Ballista in order to ping down his opponents, winning the game. Compared to our recent C20 Commanders video, I really liked this one specifically because I felt like the 2-color pairings for 3 of the decks in this video was a really cool restriction to build around. A lot of the abilities were strong. Rielle, Zirda, and Kinnan all have incredibly strong abilities, but being restricted to 2 colors made the deck building process much more enjoyable for me personally. That being said, let's do a little post-game discussion. As far as the most valuable card for this game goes, I will have to give it to Ranger Captain of Eos. As the Zirda player, that card came at the exact right time. It let me tutor up a Weathered Wayfarer, which I knew could get me an Inventor's Fair and get me into my outlets, and it let me have protection on the turn that I was going to win. That's a fantastic card, and I put it in a lot of my white decks now because it just has so much value. Outside of the most valuable card, I want to talk for a few seconds on Kinnan. This card is super strong and gets just a lot of value. We played multiple games in this stream that this video is featured on, and each of them showcased how Kinnan for our 2-drop creature can just produce insane value. Even when it's not being played to win, or even if it's not the commander, having a Kinnan on the battlefield almost doubling the mana production you have from your Mana Dorks and Mana Rocks is incredibly relevant. It helps you ramp into bigger spells faster, and the ability to dig 5 cards deep to find something like a Thrasios or a Seedborn Muse is incredibly strong. You probably only have, by the time you play that card, maybe 85 cards left in your library, so digging 5 deep once a turn is actually very relevant if you're just spinning your wheels. So this commander provides a lot of value and just a lot of ways to get back on the horse if you do end up getting stopped early. So I really do like this card, and I think it'll make its way not only as a commander into the cEDH semi-competitive meta, but also into the 99 in a lot of decks that run dork heavy or even mana rock heavy strategies in decks that have both blue and green. That being said, that does wrap up our Ikoria video. We hope you enjoyed it. If you're still watching this video at this point and you haven't heard already, be sure to check out our merch store and our Kickstarter for our playmats, and also check out our Twitch TV channel. This Sunday, we'll be streaming with Dylan and Cam from Play to Win, and it should be a great time. So if you're not already following our Twitch channel, go ahead and do that. Link is in the description. That being said, that is all we have for this video. I am Joseph. This is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.